There is a question that has quietly haunted human beings for as long as we have been capable of reflection. It is not a question about the universe, or about death, or about the meaning of existence. Though it touches all of those things, it is simpler than that, more personal, more immediate. Why do we keep going back? Why does the person who knows the relationship is destroying them still answer the phone at midnight? Why does the man who swore off drinking find himself 3 weeks later at the same bar, on the same stool, ordering the same thing? Why does the woman who made a firm decision to stop seeking approval from people who will never give it still change her outfit 4 times before a meeting, still rehearse her sentences in the car, still lie awake replaying a comment someone made in the hallway 2 days ago? Why do intelligent, self-aware, otherwise capable human beings consistently choose what hurts them over what heals them? This is the question we are going to sit with today. Not to judge it, not to shame the people who live inside it, because that is all of us in one way or another, but to understand it, truly understand it, because there is something profoundly liberating about understanding why you do what you do, even when what you do seems irrational, even when it confuses you, even when you hate yourself a little for doing it again. The first thing I want you to know is this: the fact that you return to what hurts you does not mean you are broken. It does not mean you are weak. It does not mean you lack willpower or intelligence or the capacity for change. What it means, what science and psychology and decades of human observation tell us, is that your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is not your character. The problem is that the design itself can become a trap. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you are standing in front of 2 doors. Behind one door is something familiar. You have been through that door hundreds of times. You know what it smells like on the other side. You know the temperature of the air, the sounds, the feeling under your feet. It is not always pleasant behind that door. In fact, sometimes it is painful. Sometimes you come out the other side exhausted, or hurt, or emptier than before. But you know it. You know exactly what to expect. And there is a strange comfort in that knowledge. Behind the second door is something different. Something that, by every rational measure, is better for you. But you have never been through that door. You do not know what is on the other side. You do not know if the ground is level or uneven, if the light is warm or cold, if you will feel capable or lost. The uncertainty is total. Now, without thinking about it too carefully, which door does your body lean toward? For most people, the answer is the first one. Not because they are foolish, not because they cannot see the logic of the second door, but because the brain, operating on its deepest and most ancient programming, values predictability over possibility. It values the known over the unknown, even when the known is harmful and the unknown is healing. This is the paradox we are going to spend the next 2 hours exploring together. The strange, fascinating, deeply human paradox of craving what hurts us. And here is the most important thing I want to plant in your mind right now. At the very beginning of this journey, the moment you understand why the pattern exists, you are no longer entirely inside it. Awareness is not just knowledge. Awareness is the beginning of freedom, when you can look at a craving and say not just, I want this, but I know why I want this, and I know what it costs me. In that moment, you have created a gap between stimulus and response. And in that gap, however small it may be at first, lies the possibility of a different choice. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin in the brain. To understand why we crave what hurts us, we have to understand something fundamental about how the brain learns. And to understand that, we have to talk about dopamine. Dopamine is one of the most discussed and most misunderstood chemicals in all of neuroscience. You have probably heard it described as the pleasure chemical, the thing your brain releases when something feels good. But that description, while not entirely wrong, is incomplete in ways that matter enormously, because dopamine is not really about pleasure. Dopamine is about anticipation. Dopamine is about the pursuit of reward, not the reward itself. Here is what that distinction means in practice. When a rat in a laboratory learns that pressing a lever will deliver a food pellet, its brain begins releasing dopamine, not when the food arrives, but the moment the rat sees the lever. The dopamine spike happens at the cue, the signal that reward might be coming. The brain is not saying, "This feels good." It is saying, "Something good might happen. Pay attention. Move toward it." And here is where it gets truly interesting. When a reward is certain, when pressing the lever always delivers the pellet, dopamine levels remain relatively stable. But when the reward is unpredictable, when sometimes the lever delivers food and sometimes it does not, dopamine spikes are dramatically higher. The brain becomes intensely, almost desperately engaged with uncertain rewards. Not certain ones, uncertain ones. This is why gambling is so powerfully addictive. Not because winning always happens, it does not, but because winning sometimes happens, unpredictably, on a schedule the conscious mind cannot crack. The uncertainty itself becomes the drug. This is also why social media is so difficult to put down. Every time you open an app, you might find something interesting, or validating, or entertaining. Or you might not. But the possibility, the unpredictable maybe, is enough to keep the dopamine system reaching, checking, refreshing. And this is why toxic relationships can feel, in certain moments, more compelling than stable, healthy ones. Because healthy relationships are, in a certain sense, predictable. They are safe. They are consistent. But a relationship characterized by emotional unpredictability, by cycles of withdrawal and warmth, by criticism followed by tenderness, by uncertainty about where you stand, that relationship activates the dopamine system in a way that can feel almost indistinguishable from passion. The brain does not distinguish between, "This is good for me and it excites me," and "This is uncertain and it excites me." It simply feels the activation, the chemical surge, the pull, and it leans in. Now let us go one level deeper, because dopamine is only part of the story. The brain learns through repetition. Every time a behavior is followed by a reward, even a small one, even a temporary one, even a relief from discomfort, rather than a genuine gain, a neural pathway is strengthened. The technical term is long-term potentiation. Neurons that fire together, wire together. The brain carves grooves, like water running over stone, and over time those grooves become channels. The water does not choose to run in the channel. It runs there because the channel is already there. The path of least resistance. This is the machinery of habit, not the conscious habits you set for yourself with intention and willpower, but the deep, automatic habits that operate beneath your awareness, the ones that activate before you have finished deciding whether you want them to. Here is how that process works. Every habit, at its core, has three components: a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is the trigger, a time, a place, a person, an emotion, a sensation. that tells the brain a familiar sequence is about to begin. The routine is the behavior itself, and the reward is whatever the behavior delivers: relief, pleasure, stimulation, distraction, or simply the reduction of discomfort. The important thing to understand is that the brain encodes this entire loop as a single unit. When the cue appears, the routine is already loaded, pre-staged, ready to run. The decision to execute it has been made, not by the conscious, deliberating mind, but by the automatic systems that prioritize speed and efficiency. This is why willpower so often fails. Because willpower operates in the conscious mind, and by the time your conscious mind is engaged in a debate about whether to have the drink, or scroll the phone, or send the impulsive message, the automatic systems have already begun the sequence. You are negotiating with yourself over a decision that, at a neurological level, has already been made. This does not mean you are helpless, but it means that fighting habits with willpower alone is like trying to stop a river with your hands. The river is not being stubborn. It is simply following the path it has always followed. And changing that path requires something more structural than effort. It requires understanding the architecture of the loop itself. Let us trace what this looks like in a real person's life. Consider someone who reaches for their phone every time they feel a flicker of anxiety. The cue is the emotional state, that particular quality of unease that arrives when there is uncertainty, or when the mind begins to wander towards something difficult. The routine is the checking, the scroll, the tap, the refresh, and the reward is temporary distraction. Not resolution of the anxiety, not understanding of it, just momentary relief from it. Over weeks, months, years, this sequence runs hundreds of times. The neural pathway becomes a superhighway. The brain does not think, "I am anxious, and I have chosen to distract myself." It thinks nothing at all in the deliberate sense. The cue appears, the hand moves, the phone is in hand before the conscious mind has registered what happened. Now consider what this means. It means that a person could sincerely believe they want to change, could genuinely dislike the pattern, could feel real shame about it, and still find themselves executing the sequence automatically, repeatedly, in the same way. Not because they are lying about wanting to change, but because wanting to change and having a different automatic response are two entirely different things. One happens in the conscious mind. The other is encoded in the architecture of the nervous system. This gap between knowing and doing, between wanting and behaving, is the central drama of human psychology. It is the source of so much confusion, self-judgment, and suffering, because we hold ourselves to a standard that assumes we are always acting from our highest, most rational intentions. But we are not. We are acting, most of the time, from patterns laid down long before the current moment, patterns shaped by conditioning, repetition, and the brain's relentless drive to solve the equation of survival. The reward system, remember, does not care about your long-term well-being. It cares about the immediate. It cares about the next few seconds, the next few minutes. Long-term consequences require the prefrontal cortex, the brain's planning and reasoning center, to override the limbic system's immediate desires. And the prefrontal cortex, as brilliant as it is slow. The limbic system is fast. In the race between craving and reasoning, craving almost always gets to the finish line first. This is why so many of us can articulate our problems with extraordinary clarity and still not change them. We are articulate in our prefrontal cortex and imprisoned in our limbic system. We know in the abstract what we should do. But in the visceral, heated moment of craving, knowledge is a thin rope against a strong current. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior, but it does something more important than excusing it. It explains it. And explanation, real explanation, is the first brick in the road toward change. There is one more piece of the neuroscience puzzle I want to place here before we move forward, and it is perhaps the most unsettling one. The brain does not just become habituated to external rewards, to food, substances, validation, or stimulation. It becomes habituated to internal states, to emotional experiences, to the particular quality of certain feelings. There is research suggesting that the stress hormones circulating in your body, cortisol, adrenaline, can become chemically familiar, that the nervous system can, over time, come to expect them, even to need them. Not because stress feels good, but because it feels normal, because it is the baseline the body has come to calibrate around. This means that a person raised in an environment of high stress, emotional volatility, unpredictability, danger, may find calm, in adulthood, uncomfortable. Not because they prefer suffering, but because the nervous system does not recognize calm as normal. It recognizes it as suspicious, as the quiet before something bad happens. And so unconsciously, that person may create situations that generate familiar stress, may gravitate toward chaotic relationships, high-pressure environments, perpetual crisis, not to suffer, but because the body has come to associate that particular cocktail of neurochemicals with aliveness, with safety in its most primitive sense, with the known. This is where trauma and neuroscience intersect. This is where early experience writes itself, not just into memory, but into the body, into the very set point of the nervous system. And it is why healing, for many people, is not simply a matter of making better decisions. It is a matter of teaching the nervous system that calm is safe, that ordinary is enough. That peace does not have to be earned by crisis. We will return to this. But for now, hold it. Hold the image of a nervous system that has learned to crave its own familiar stress. And ask yourself, gently, what familiar emotional states you might be recreating without knowing why. There is a phrase that lies at the heart of everything we are exploring today, and it comes from the work of psychologists who study human motivation and avoidance. The phrase is this: familiar pain is more comfortable than unfamiliar relief. Read that slowly. Familiar pain is more comfortable than unfamiliar relief. It sounds strange at first, perhaps even offensive. Who in their right mind would choose pain over relief? But the key word is familiar, because comfort, as the brain experiences it, is not the same as pleasant. Comfort, neurologically speaking, means predictable. It means the brain knows what is coming. It means the cognitive load of navigating novelty is avoided. When you are in a situation you have been in before, even a painful one, your brain has a map. It knows where the walls are. It knows roughly how it will feel, and how long that feeling will last, and what comes after. And as strange as it sounds, there is a kind of relief in that knowledge. Not happiness, not well-being, but a reduction in the particular anxiety of not knowing. Unfamiliar growth, on the other hand, arrives without a map. Recovery from addiction does not look like anything you have seen before. Leaving a long relationship, even a damaging one, means standing in territory your nervous system has never charted. Changing your career, setting a boundary for the first time, choosing honesty after years of performance. These things do not just require courage. They require the brain to operate without its usual scaffolding. and the brain resists that deeply. This is why people return to old patterns even after they have intellectually committed to new ones. It is not because they secretly love their suffering. It is because the new behavior, however logically superior, lacks the neurological ease of the old one. The old pattern runs on rails. The new one requires every step to be consciously chosen, and consciousness is exhausting. Psychologists call this status quo bias, the deep human tendency to prefer the current state of affairs over any alternative, even a better one. Behavioral economists have shown that people demand significantly more money to give up something they already have than they would pay to acquire the same thing. We overweight what we possess, what we know, what we are accustomed to. This is not irrationality in the pejorative sense. It is a deep feature of how minds process change under uncertainty, and growth, almost by definition, involves uncertainty. Think about the moments in your own life when you stood at a threshold of genuine change. A moment when you could have spoken the truth instead of staying quiet. A moment when you could have asked for help instead of struggling alone. A moment when you could have walked away from something that was slowly diminishing you, and notice what happened in the body in that moment. The contraction, the hesitation, the very physical sense of something pulling you back. That pull is real. It is not weakness. It is the organism doing what organisms do, protecting the familiar, minimizing risk, conserving the energy of uncertainty. But the body's definition of risk and the soul's definition of risk are often in direct conflict. The body says the unfamiliar is dangerous. The deeper self, the part of you that knows what you are capable of and what you are here for, knows that sometimes the most dangerous thing is to stay. This tension between the safety of the known and the necessity of the unknown is one of the defining psychological dramas of a human life. It plays out in careers, in relationships, in creative work, in spiritual practice, in every domain where growth requires leaving the solid ground of the familiar, and it plays out in a particularly poignant way in the domain of identity, because who you are, or rather, who you believe yourself to be, is also a familiar pattern. And any change that requires you to become something different than you currently are will, at some level, feel like a threat to the self. This is the concept psychologists call identity-based resistance to change. We do not just have habits of behavior. We have habits of self-perception. Narratives we have told about ourselves so many times that they feel like facts. I am someone who struggles with relationships. I am not the kind of person who finishes things. I am too much, or not enough, or fundamentally difficult to love. These stories, painful as they are familiar. And the brain protects them with remarkable tenacity, because if the story is wrong, if you are not, in fact, fundamentally difficult to love, then all the decisions you made based on that story must be re-examined. The entire architecture of self-understanding must be rebuilt. And that is terrifying, even when the alternative is freedom. This is why people sometimes undermine their own therapy. Why they stop just before the breakthrough. Why the person making real progress suddenly stops showing up, or engineers a crisis that consumes the energy they were using for growth. Not because they do not want to heal, but because healing requires becoming someone slightly different than who they have always been. And the psyche, which has organized itself around a particular self-concept, resists the dissolution of that concept, even when the concept is painful. The unfamiliar relief feels more threatening than familiar pain because the familiar pain is at least mine. It is who I am, and losing who I am, even who I am in suffering, feels like a kind of death. This is the deepest level of the trap, not just behavioral pattern, not just neurological habit, but identity. The story of who you are that you have been writing and rewriting since childhood, in the ink of your experiences and the language of your earliest relationships. We will talk about how to change that story. But first, I want to tell you about someone who could not. At least, not yet. Because sometimes the clearest mirror of a psychological truth is not an explanation but a story. His name, for our purposes, is Daniel. And Daniel was, by most external measures, a successful man. He ran a small consulting firm in a mid-sized city. He had a daughter he adored, and a comfortable apartment, and a social circle of people who respected and generally liked him. He was articulate, thoughtful, self-aware enough to know that his life had patterns that did not serve him. He had read the books. He had done, at various points, the therapy. He understood, in the way educated people understand things, why he was the way he was. And yet, every relationship Daniel entered eventually took the same shape. In the beginning there was electricity, the intoxicating uncertainty of early connection, the dopamine of possibility. Then, as the relationship stabilized, as the other person showed up consistently and offered him something reliable and warm, Daniel would feel something he could only describe as restlessness. A vague sense that something was missing, that the connection had gone flat somehow, that he was not as interested as he should be, and then, reliably, almost mechanically, something would happen. He would pull back emotionally, create a small distance, or pick a fight over something that, in retrospect, did not matter, or allow his attention to drift towards someone else, someone new, someone whose interest in him still had that quality of uncertain possibility. He hated this about himself. He genuinely did. He could see the pattern with perfect clarity. He could trace its origins. A childhood with a mother who was warm and loving when she was well, but emotionally unavailable during the depressions that came and went throughout his early years. An experience of love that was, by its nature, unpredictable. Sometimes the warmth was there, sometimes it was not, and his nervous system had learned, had been trained, in the most literal neurological sense, to associate love with that quality of uncertainty, to find it there, to seek it there. He knew this. He had discussed it in therapy at length, had cried about it, had felt the connection between his childhood and his present with what felt like genuine insight. And he would leave those sessions resolved, clear-eyed, committed to doing differently. And then another relationship would begin, and the early electricity would feel so real, and the stability, when it arrived, would feel like flatness. And the restlessness would arrive, uninvited, dressed so convincingly in the language of incompatibility that he would believe it. He would tell himself he had found something honest, a recognition that this particular relationship was simply not right, that he was protecting both himself and the other person by leaving. He was very good at the story. He had told it many times. There was a woman, her name was Maya, who did not perform for him, who did not chase him when he pulled back, who simply remained present, steady, unimpressed by his restlessness, and offered him the particular gift of a love that did not require him to be uncertain to feel alive. He almost destroyed it in the first 3 months. He picked fights. He became critical in the small, grinding way of someone who is not truly upset about the dishes or the lateness but is underneath it all, desperately trying to manufacture the familiar emotional weather of anxiety and pursuit. And Maya, who was perceptive and had done some of her own work, looked at him one evening and said something he was not expecting. She said, "I think you're doing this on purpose. I don't think you know you're doing it, but I think some part of you needs this to feel uncertain." He denied it, of course, with conviction, but that night he could not sleep, because the thing about truth is that it does not need you to accept it in order for it to work on you. It just settles, quietly, into the places in the mind that are still soft. And slowly, over the following weeks, Daniel began watching himself with a different quality of attention, not just the reflective observer who had always been able to articulate his patterns, but something closer to a scientist. Curious, clinical, watching the moment the restlessness appeared, noticing what had happened just before it, noticing what it felt like in the body, noticing the speed with which his mind began building a story, a case for leaving, a case for distance, a case for the relationship's inadequacy. He began to see something he had not seen before, not just that he created distance when things became stable, but that the restlessness arrived in a very specific moment, the moment when he felt genuinely seen, when the warmth was real and consistent, when there was nothing to pursue because he already had it. That was the trigger, not boredom, not incompatibility, not flatness, but fullness, real intimacy, the thing he had told himself he wanted, because real intimacy was terrifying, because real intimacy required him to be truly present, truly received, truly loved, not as a performance, not as someone charming and impressive at a careful distance, but as he actually was, and that person, his actual self, the one behind the articulation and the insight and the social fluency. That person was not sure he was lovable. That person had learned, at an age before memory, that love was conditional, intermittent, something you had to earn and re-earn and could never quite hold. Daniel did not leave Maya. Not that time. But he almost did. And the story of why he almost did, and what happened in the narrow space between the impulse and the choice, that is a story we will return to. Because it is in that narrow space that everything changes. Let us talk now about emotions, because what we have been circling, in our discussion of dopamine and habit and familiar pain, is really a story about emotional experience, about the way emotions function, not just as feelings but as forces, not just as responses to circumstances but as organizers of behavior, as architects of the patterns we live inside. Here is something the research shows us clearly: emotions are not just experienced. They are repeated. The brain does not simply register an emotional response and move on. It encodes the response, stores it, and when a situation arises that resembles, even vaguely, even in metaphor, the original trigger, the stored emotional response begins to activate before the conscious mind has time to process the current situation on its own terms. Psychologists call this emotional conditioning, and it is, in many ways, even more powerful than cognitive conditioning because emotions are processed in the brain's faster, older systems. They do not require conscious thought to activate. They arrive fully formed, with urgency, dressed in the absolute conviction of being appropriate to the present moment. This is what happens when someone who was criticized harshly as a child becomes, as an adult, unreasonably defensive when offered even mild feedback. The emotional response, the shame, the contracted chest, the urge to flee or counter, attack, arrives before the rational mind has time to evaluate the actual tone or intention of the feedback. The past is speaking through the present. The child's nervous system is interpreting an adult situation. This is also what happens in what therapists sometimes call repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate emotionally familiar situations, even painful ones, as though the psyche is trying, over and over, to resolve something that was never resolved the first time. The man who keeps finding himself in relationships with emotionally unavailable partners is not making bad choices. He is following an emotional map drawn in childhood, trying to find, in the present, the resolution he could not find then. Trying to get the love he did not receive from someone who resembles, emotionally if not literally, the person who withheld it. And the tragedy is that this strategy almost never works, because the emotionally unavailable person you choose in adulthood will not, in the end, give you the love you were seeking, and the resolution you are trying to achieve cannot be found in the external world at all. It has to be found inside, in the grief of what was not received, in the compassion for the child who adapted as best they could, in the recognition that the map you have been following was drawn long ago and does not accurately represent the territory you are standing in now. But emotional maps are not updated by reasoning. They are updated by experience. New, repeated, emotionally significant experience that contradicts the map. This is part of why healing is slow and why good therapy takes time. Not because the insights are elusive, but because the nervous system requires experience. Real, embodied, repeated experience to write new patterns over old ones. Here is another dimension of emotional self-sabotage that deserves careful attention. Many people, without being fully aware of it, use emotional intensity as a substitute for intimacy. They mistake the drama of conflict and crisis for depth of connection. They mistake the emotional weather of anxiety and relief for passion. They mistake the exhaustion of emotional battle for the feeling of being truly invested in something. This confusion is almost universal in people who grew up in emotionally volatile environments, when love and chaos came from the same direction, when care and criticism were often inseparable, when the people who were supposed to be safe were also sources of unpredictability. Then the nervous system learns to associate intimacy with intensity. It learns that when things are quiet and even unstable, something might be missing. That connection requires a certain amount of upheaval to feel real. And so these individuals find themselves, in adulthood, drawn to relationships that generate high emotional intensity, not because they enjoy the fighting, the jealousy, the walking on eggshells, but because those experiences feel, in a deeply embedded way, like love, like realness, like the particular proof that the connection is alive, and relationships that are genuinely healthy, where there is consistency, mutual respect, clear communication, and the absence of manufactured crisis, can feel, to someone with this emotional template, almost clinical, disappointing, like friendship without fire. The emotional map says if it does not hurt sometimes, if it does not keep you guessing, if you always know where you stand, it is probably not love. And that map will lead you, faithfully and consistently, away from every healthy relationship you encounter and toward every destructive one, not because you are broken, but because you are following directions. The directions are simply wrong. Updating them requires something braver than knowing they are wrong. It requires staying in the new territory long enough for the body to learn that safety is not the same as absence of love, That steadiness can be a form of passion. That being truly known is more intimate than being endlessly pursued. This is the emotional re-education that genuine change requires. And it is hard. It is genuinely, rewardingly, necessarily hard. We have been talking about patterns in the mind and the nervous system. But there is a concept that operates at the intersection of all of these things that deserves its own careful attention. It is one of the most seductive traps in the human experience. And it goes by a name that sounds innocent, even positive: comfort. We are told to seek comfort. Comfort is sold to us as an aspiration, a warm home, a reliable routine, the absence of friction. And there is nothing wrong with comfort in itself. The body needs rest. The mind needs relief from constant stimulation. Peace is not the enemy. But there is a quality of comfort that becomes, over time, a kind of cage, a zone of habits and avoidances and routines so familiar that stepping outside it begins to feel genuinely threatening. And the danger of this zone is precisely that it does not feel like suffering. It feels like normal. It feels like home. People often stay in deeply unsatisfying situations, careers that do not use their real gifts, relationships that have long since stopped nourishing them, cities or communities that no longer fit who they have become. Not because they cannot see that the situation is not working, but because the discomfort of leaving has been carefully tallied, and the discomfort of staying has been normalized. The staying does not feel like a daily cost because it has been amortized into the background. It is the quiet suffering that has been there so long. It is simply part of the furniture. Psychologists use the term hedonic adaptation to describe the brain's tendency to adjust its baseline level of happiness to its current circumstances. What this means in practice is that both positive and negative changes in life circumstances eventually lose their emotional charge. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, the painful becomes expected, and we return, reliably, to whatever our baseline set point is. This adaptation is, in many ways, a marvel of psychological resilience. It allows people to survive genuine hardship without being permanently undone. But it also means that we can adapt to circumstances that should not be adapted to. We can normalize what should never be considered normal. We can reach a place where we have forgotten what it feels like to be genuinely alive inside our own lives. The comfort zone, at its most insidious, is not a zone of happiness. It is a zone of numbness that the mind has learned to mistake for contentment. And here is the neurological mechanism that maintains it. Anytime you approach the boundary of your comfort zone, anytime you are about to do something novel, uncertain, or challenging, the brain activates a threat response. Not a dramatic one, not necessarily fear in the full physiological sense, but a low-grade alertness. A mild anxiety, a sense that something is slightly wrong, and the brain offers a very simple solution: retreat. Return to the familiar. The anxiety drops. The relief is immediate, and that immediate relief is a reward, which means the pattern is reinforced. The brain learns approaching boundaries to anxiety, retreating from boundaries to relief. Do not approach boundaries. This is the mechanism that keeps people small, not dramatically, not cruelly, but quietly, persistently small. Every act of avoidance provides temporary relief and long-term constriction. Every retreat from growth makes the boundary slightly harder to approach next time. And over months, over years, over decades, the comfort zone can shrink without the person inside it noticing. Until one day they look around and realize that the world accessible to them has become very, very narrow. The cruelty of this is that it does not feel like imprisonment. It feels like preference. It feels like reasonable self-protection. And the voice of the comfort zone is one of the most convincing voices you will ever hear, because it speaks in the language of practicality and caution and self-knowledge. It says things like, "This is just who I am. I know my limits. I am being realistic. I am not built for that." And sometimes those things are true. There is wisdom in knowing yourself. There is genuine self-compassion in recognizing what you need. But sometimes those things are the comfort zone speaking in the voice of wisdom. Sounding reasonable. Sounding self-aware. Protecting not your actual limits, but the limits it has drawn for you through years of accumulated avoidance. Learning to hear the difference between genuine self-knowledge and the voice of fear dressed in the costume of wisdom. That is one of the most important skills a human being can develop. And it is a skill. It can be learned. It becomes more reliable with practice. But it requires a willingness to be uncomfortable, to sit in the uncertainty of not yet knowing which voice is speaking, and to move anyway. There is a phrase I find deeply useful here, and it comes from the world of somatic psychology. The body keeps the score. The patterns we carry are not only in our thoughts. They live in the body, in the way we hold our shoulders when we enter a room, in the tightening of the throat when someone asks us a question we do not want to answer honestly, in the shallow breathing that arrives when we are about to do something that the nervous system has classified as outside our comfort zone. Noticing these physical signals is not navel-gazing. It is one of the most precise instruments available for tracking the boundary between your actual self and the comfortable fiction of your limitations. The body often knows before the mind admits. And now we arrive at the most important word in this entire conversation. Awareness, not willpower, not discipline, not strategy or information or the right book or the right therapist, though all of those have their place. Awareness. Here is why awareness is so central to change. When a behavior is automatic, when it runs as a pre-programmed sequence in response to a cue, it is by definition unconscious. The person executing it is not choosing it in any meaningful sense. They are enacting it. There is a difference. Enormous difference. Choice requires awareness. Not awareness of the behavior after it has happened, in the familiar moment of regret and self-criticism, but awareness in the moment before, awareness at the cue, awareness in the gap between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote one of the most important books of the 20th century, said something that has stayed with me since the first time I encountered it. He said, between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, between what triggers us and what we do next, is where everything happens, and that space can be widened. It can be deliberately, intentionally widened through the practice of awareness. Here is what this means practically. When the cue arrives, the emotion, the situation, the sensory trigger that has always initiated the habitual sequence, awareness inserts a pause, not a dramatic pause, not a long philosophical rumination, just a breath's worth of recognition, a fraction of a second where something says, "I know what this is. I have been here before." This is the part where I usually do the thing that does not serve me. That recognition, that tiny moment of seeing the pattern as it is happening rather than after it has happened, that is awareness. And that awareness, fragile and fleeting as it may be at first, is the fulcrum on which everything else turns. The neuroscience supports this. Research on mindfulness and habit change consistently shows that people who develop the capacity to observe their own mental states, to notice thoughts and cravings and emotional impulses without immediately acting on them, develop, over time, greater behavioral flexibility, not because they suppress their automatic responses, but because they create enough distance from those responses to make room for a different one. This is what mindfulness is, at its core. Not relapsation, though relapsation can be a side effect. Not the absence of thought, which is a common misconception, but the practice of observing the contents of the mind without being entirely captured by them. Learning to see a craving as a craving, rather than a command. Learning to see an emotion as a weather system passing through, rather than a permanent truth about reality. Learning to watch the automatic story the mind tells and ask, is this true? Or is this just familiar? This capacity, what psychologists sometimes call metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, is one of the most powerful tools available for change. And it is trainable. It improves with practice the way a muscle improves with use. But I want to be careful here, because awareness can also become a trap. There is a kind of awareness that loops perpetually on itself, without ever leading to action. The person who understands their patterns in extraordinary detail, but never changes them, because understanding has become its own comfort zone. The person who can describe the architecture of their self-sabotage with the precision of a craftsman, but who has developed analysis as a way of avoiding the harder thing, which is not understanding but doing. True awareness is not just seeing the pattern. True awareness is seeing the pattern and allowing that seeing to change your relationship to it, allowing the observation to create the space for a different response. Not eventually, not in theory, but in the actual moment when the cue arrives and the habitual sequence begins to load. This is a practice. It is called a practice because it requires exactly that, practice. The first time you try to insert awareness into an automatic sequence, the sequence usually wins. It is too fast, too well established, too deeply grooved. The second time may be the same, but over time, the quality of observation becomes more nimble. You catch the pattern earlier. You recognize the cue before the routine has fully engaged. You find yourself in the gap, that precious, expanding gap, with something that was not there before, a genuine question about what you want to do next. Now let us talk about what comes after awareness, because awareness is the door, but it is not the room. The room is built from new behavior, new experience, new neurological pathways carved by repetition in a different direction. There is a principle in neuroscience that is sometimes summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. We have already visited this idea. But the corollary is equally important: neurons that no longer fire together, no longer wire together. Pathways that are not used become less efficient. They do not disappear entirely. The memory of a habit, the ghost of a pattern, can persist for years, but they lose their automatic urgency. They become, over time, less like a highway and more like a dirt road, still navigable, but no longer the path of least resistance. This is the scientific basis for hope. It is not poetry, not wishful thinking. It is the literal plasticity of the brain. The brain changes in response to experience throughout the entire human lifespan. Not as easily as it does in childhood, not as dramatically as it does in adolescence, but genuinely, meaningfully, measurably. The process of rewiring begins with habit substitution, because you cannot, in the long run, simply remove a habitual behavior. The cue will still arrive. The routine will be summoned. If there is nothing to replace it with, the original behavior will fill the vacuum. Think of it this way. Every habit, as we discussed, has a cue, a routine, and a reward. The most durable approach to change is to keep the cue and the reward but replace the routine. The cue is often not within your control. The anxiety will arrive, the loneliness will arrive, the particular quality of afternoon light that always made you reach for the drink will arrive. The reward, the relief, the stimulation, the sense of connection is what the behavior was always delivering. That need is real. It is not the problem. The problem is the delivery mechanism. So find a different delivery mechanism. This is the engineering of behavior change. It requires self-knowledge, creativity, and experimentation. Because the substitute behavior must provide a genuine version of the reward, not just a logical substitute. A person using alcohol to manage social anxiety cannot replace it with a glass of water if the water does not also provide some reduction of the anxiety. They need a substitute that genuinely addresses the underlying need. Whether that is a physical practice that regulates the nervous system, a cognitive strategy that changes the interpretation of the social situation, or a relational resource that provides the reassurance the anxiety is seeking. This is why generic advice about habit change so often fails. Telling someone to just replace the bad habit with exercise or meditation or journaling is not wrong, exactly. But it misses the specificity required. The substitute needs to serve the same function as the original, and that function is often less obvious than it appears. What does the procrastination protect you from? What does the drinking soothe? What need does the obsessive checking of the phone actually address? These are not rhetorical questions. They require genuine investigation, and the answers are often surprising. Often the behavior that looks like laziness is protecting against the terror of failure. Often the behavior that looks like hedonism is medicating profound loneliness. Often the behavior that looks like self-destruction is a deeply human attempt to regulate an unregulated inner world. Understanding what the behavior does for you is not the same as justifying it, but it is the essential prerequisite for replacing it with something that actually works. Alongside habit substitution, there is the practice of emotional regulation, because many destructive patterns are, at their root, strategies for managing emotional states that feel overwhelming. And as long as those emotional states remain overwhelming, as long as anxiety or shame or loneliness or grief arrive at a level of intensity that exceeds the person's capacity to tolerate them, the old behaviors will remain attractive. Emotional regulation is a skill, and it is a skill that many people never learned, not because they were incapable of learning it, but because no one taught them. In families where emotions were not acknowledged, or were expressed through chaos rather than language, or were treated as burdensome, the children growing up in those families did not develop the internal resources for managing emotional intensity. And as adults, they carry that gap, not as a flaw of character, but as an unmet developmental need. Learning to regulate emotions begins with learning to tolerate them. To feel an uncomfortable emotion, anxiety, grief, loneliness, shame, without immediately acting to escape it. To breathe into the feeling. To notice where it lives in the body. To recognize that the feeling, however intense, is temporary, that it will not last forever. that you can survive it without the behavior you have always used to flee from it. This is not simple. The first times you try it, it will feel unbearable. The discomfort of feeling without escaping is genuinely difficult. But it becomes less difficult with repetition, for the same neurological reason that everything becomes easier with repetition. The experience of surviving the emotion without acting on it is itself data. It teaches the nervous system. You can feel this and not be destroyed by it, and gradually, the emotional intensity that once required immediate action begins to feel more manageable. Alongside regulation is the practice of conscious decision-making, what psychologists sometimes call implementation intentions. Research shows that deciding in advance, specifically and concretely, what you will do when a particular cue arises dramatically increases the likelihood of following through on the intended behavior. Not because the cue or the craving changes, but because the decision has already been made, already encoded, and does not need to compete with the automatic response in real time. If I encounter this situation, I will do this specific thing. The specificity matters. The if-then structure matters, because it creates a competing automatic response, one that you have intentionally planted in the place of the old one. It is not a replacement for awareness, but it is a complement to it. Awareness opens the gap. Implementation intention fills it with something new. We have spent a great deal of time exploring the architecture of the trap, the neuroscience of craving, the psychology of familiar pain, the mechanics of emotional conditioning. And now, at this place in our journey, I want to turn toward something that might seem paradoxical given everything we have discussed. The argument for short-term pain in service of long-term freedom. Because everything we have explored points to the same fundamental dynamic. The destructive patterns that govern so much of human behavior all share a common feature. They deliver immediate relief at the cost of long-term well-being. The drink numbs now and damages later. The avoidance relieves now and diminishes later. The impulsive message sends the rush of expression now and costs the relationship later. The comfort zone preserves ease now and forfeits growth later. This is the temporal dimension of self-sabotage, the gap between the moment of reward and the moment of consequence, between when the pattern feels good and when it shows its full cost. And the inverse is equally true. The behaviors that generate genuine, lasting well-being are almost universally characterized by short-term discomfort and long-term reward. Exercise is uncomfortable in the moment and beneficial over time. Honest conversation is uncomfortable now and connective over time. Setting a boundary is painful in the immediate encounter and liberating over the course of a life. Sitting with an emotion rather than escaping it is hard in the moment and strengthening over time. This is what we mean when we talk about discipline, creating psychological freedom. Not the grim, punitive discipline of self-denial and rigid rules, but the living discipline of consistently choosing what serves your deeper well-being over what offers temporary relief. The discipline of staying in the conversation when the urge to flee is strong. The discipline of not checking the phone at 2 in the morning when the anxiety arrives. The discipline of finishing the thing you said you would finish, even when the initial excitement has faded, and what remains is only the quiet work. This kind of discipline is not natural. The brain does not reward it automatically. The dopamine system does not pulse with pleasure when you make a decision whose rewards will not arrive for weeks or months. You are working against the design in a very real sense. And this is why it requires not just willpower, which, as we have established, is an unreliable fuel, but something deeper, something more structural. It requires values, a clear, felt sense of what you actually want your life to be. Not the life that provides immediate comfort, but the life that, when you are old and looking back, will seem to you to have been worthy of the time you were given. That felt sense of what you are living toward, not just away from, is the anchor that keeps the ship from drifting when the winds of craving arrive. Research in psychology consistently shows that people with a strong sense of meaning and purpose are more capable of tolerating short-term discomfort in service of long-term goals, not because meaning makes difficulty easy, but because difficulty in service of meaning is a fundamentally different experience than difficulty without purpose. The discomfort of training for something you care about is bearable in a way that arbitrary discomfort is not. And so the practice of choosing long-term freedom over short-term relief is also, necessarily, the practice of clarifying what you value, of asking yourself, with real honesty, not what you want right now, but what kind of person you want to become, what kind of relationships you want to inhabit, what kind of work you want to do, what you want to be able to say at the end that your days were spent in service of. These questions are not abstract, they are urgently practical, because the answers, clear, honest, personal answers, become the compass that guides behavior when the automatic systems are pointing in the wrong direction. There is another piece of this that I do not want to skip past, because it is where so many genuine efforts at change break down. It is the question of self-compassion, because change is not linear. The patterns we are discussing are deeply rooted, neurologically robust, emotionally charged, and identity adjacent. Changing them takes time, and in that time, there will be relapses. There will be moments when the old pattern wins, when you find yourself back in the familiar territory of the behavior you were working to leave behind. And the response to that relapse, the internal response, the story you tell yourself about what it means, matters enormously, because the most common response is shame, and shame, counterintuitively, is one of the most powerful reinforcers of the very behaviors you are trying to change. Here is the mechanism. Shame, the experience of being fundamentally bad, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally inadequate, is itself an aversive emotional state, and the brain will seek relief from aversive states. And the fastest available relief, for most people, is the very pattern they are trying to break. The shame of relapse drives the relapse that drives the shame. A loop with no exit, because the exit was paved over by the very feeling designed to prevent the behavior. Self-compassion is not self-indulgence. It is not lowering your standards or excusing your behavior. It is the recognition that you are a human being navigating deeply complex psychological territory, and that difficulty in that navigation is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of effort, of genuine, hard, necessary effort. Research by Kristin Neff and others shows that self-compassion, treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a good friend who was struggling, is strongly associated with greater motivation for change, greater resilience in the face of setbacks, and greater long-term success at behavior change than self-criticism. Not in spite of being gentle with yourself, because of it, because the person who can fail and still maintain their sense of worth does not need to flee the failure into the anesthetic of the old pattern. They can look at what happened, understand it, make a different plan, and keep moving. This is what self-compassion actually enables, not the abandonment of growth, but the capacity to keep growing even when growth is imperfect. Even when the path doubles back, even when you have to begin again. And beginning again is not defeat. It is the practice itself. Now let me tell you about Sophia. Sophia was 41 years old when she began to really understand, that the life she was living had been organized around a single principle she had never consciously chosen. The principle was, I must make myself indispensable to other people, or I will be left. She could trace it. With a therapist she had finally committed to seeing, to an early and formative experience of abandonment. A parent who left when she was 6 and who, in the years that followed, showed up intermittently, enthusiastically for brief periods, and then disappeared again. A child's mind, organizing experience into patterns, had reached a conclusion. People leave unless you give them a reason to stay, unless you are useful, unless you anticipate their needs before they know they have them, unless you make yourself, in some essential way, impossible to replace. For 35 years, this principle had shaped almost every important relationship and decision in Sophia's life. Her career as a social worker, genuinely meaningful to her, but also, she came to see, structured around her need to be needed. Her marriage to a man who was emotionally remote and who needed a great deal of managing, which she provided, expertly, until she had almost nothing left for herself. Her friendships, characterized by a pronounced asymmetry in which she gave consistently and received rarely. She was exhausted. She had been exhausted for so long that she had mistaken the exhaustion for her personality. She thought, I am a person who gives a lot. That is who I am. She did not yet see, I am a person who is afraid to receive, who has structured her entire life to avoid the vulnerability of having needs that other people might not meet. When her therapist first suggested this to her, she was insulted. She was not afraid of vulnerability. She talked about her feelings. She was self-aware. She had read the books. But the therapist asked her a simple question. When did you last let someone take care of you? And Sophia could not remember. Not because no one had tried, but because every time someone had moved toward her with care, with genuine, uncomplicated, reciprocal care, she had found a way to redirect it, to turn it into an opportunity to caretake them instead, to make herself the helper, even when she was the one who needed help, because receiving felt dangerous in a way she had never fully recognized. Receiving meant you needed something, and needing something meant someone could leave by not providing it. The awareness, when it arrived, was not dramatic. It was quiet. It arrived in the middle of a completely ordinary moment. A friend offering to bring dinner when Sophia was sick, and Sophia's immediate, reflexive, almost frantic insistence that she was fine, that she didn't need anything, that she would manage, and then the pause, the noticing. Something in her watching that refusal and knowing, for the first time with real clarity, what it was doing. She let her friend bring the dinner. That was the beginning. Not the end, the beginning. Over the following months, Sophia practiced receiving, deliberately, uncomfortably, against every instinct. She let people help her. She said what she needed. She stayed in moments of care without immediately redirecting them. She discovered, slowly, and then with gathering momentum, that people did not leave when she had needs. That her needs were not, as it turned out, more than most people could handle. That she had been carrying an emergency alone that was never quite as much of an emergency as she had made it. She did not heal overnight. The pull toward the old pattern was persistent and familiar and felt, sometimes, like common sense. But she had named it, and naming it had changed her relationship to it. She was no longer inside the pattern, carried by it without knowing. She was beside it, watching it. And in the watching, choosing something different. Her marriage did not survive. Her husband was not, it turned out, interested in a partner who had equal needs. He had chosen her, unconsciously, for the same reasons she had chosen him: the familiar shape of the dynamic, the mutual fit of their respective wounds. When she changed, the architecture of the relationship could not hold. That was painful, more painful than she had anticipated. But it was not the kind of pain that contracts a life. It was the kind of pain that expands it. The pain of shedding something that had held you small. The necessary, clarifying pain of becoming more fully yourself. She is, by her own account, not a finished person. She does not think in those terms anymore. She thinks in terms of direction. She is moving in the right direction. That is enough. And so we arrive at the end of this journey, or perhaps more accurately, at the beginning of the one that follows. Because everything we have explored together, the dopamine loops, the comfort zone, the emotional maps drawn in childhood, the familiar pain preferred over unfamiliar growth, all of it has been pointing toward a single, simple, radical possibility. The possibility of seeing yourself clearly enough to choose. Not perfectly, not without effort, not without the occasional stumble back into familiar territory, but with the particular quality of awareness that changes your relationship to your own patterns. That creates, in the gap between stimulus and response, something that was not there before, the felt sense of agency. The knowledge that you are not merely your history, that you are not only the sum of your conditioned responses, that you have, at every moment, however constrained, the capacity to choose the next step. This is not a small thing. In a life, in a single human life, it is everything. The mind, as we have seen, is not always drawn to what is good for you. It is often drawn to what is familiar, to the predictable reward, however small, to the relief, however temporary, to the known, however limiting. This is not a flaw of character. It is a feature of the architecture. The design is doing what it was designed to do. But the design is not destiny, because woven into that same human brain, the one that calculates the shortest path to reward and automates behavior to conserve energy, is something extraordinary, something that no other creature on this planet appears to possess in the same form. The capacity for self-observation, for metacognition, for standing slightly outside your own experience and asking what is happening here. Why am I doing this? Is this really what I want? That capacity, that glorious, difficult, transformative capacity, is the counterweight to everything we have discussed. It is the thing that makes the biological machinery not your master, but your material. Something you can work with. Something you can, gradually and imperfectly and courageously, change. The person who understands why they crave what hurts them is in a fundamentally different position than the person who does not. Not because understanding is magic, not because insight automatically generates action, but because insight creates the space in which action can be chosen. And that space, however narrow it may be at first, is where your freedom lies. You will not change everything at once. You are not supposed to. The patterns that took decades to build will not dissolve in a session, or a book, or a conversation, however illuminating. Change is incremental. It is unglamorous. It asks for your patience as often as your courage. But consider the direction. Consider that each time you insert awareness into a habitual sequence, you are doing something neurologically real. You are creating a new moment of choice where only automaticity existed before. You are building the neural architecture of freedom, one deliberately chosen response at a time. Consider that each time you choose discomfort in service of growth, each time you stay in the difficult conversation, tolerate the anxiety without escaping it, reach for the new behavior instead of the familiar one, you are not just doing something good in that moment. You are changing who you are. You are becoming, incrementally and irreversibly, someone for whom that choice is more available. Consider that each time you meet your own, failing with compassion rather than shame, you are refusing to fuel the cycle that shame has always fueled. You are treating yourself as someone worthy of patience and understanding. And that self-regard, that basic respect for your own humanness, is the soil in which genuine change grows. You are not the sum of your worst patterns. You are not defined by what you have returned to, again and again, in moments of weakness or fear or confusion. You are defined, in the end, by what you do with the understanding you gain, by whether the seeing changes the doing, by the choices you make, slowly and imperfectly, in the direction of your own becoming. The mind craves the familiar. The heart craves meaning. The body craves ease. And somewhere beneath all of those cravings, quieter and more persistent than any of them, there is a self that craves something harder to name. Authenticity, perhaps. Integrity. The sense of living a life that is actually yours, rather than a life assembled from habits and avoidances and second-hand definitions of who you are. That craving, the one that will not quite let you rest, the one that makes you pick up books like this one, that makes you ask the uncomfortable questions, that brings you back, again and again, to the conviction that something different is possible. That is the most important craving of all. Follow it, not away from your difficulty, through it, with eyes open and compassion ready and the hard, one understanding that the patterns which held you are not all that you are. You are the one who noticed, and noticing, genuinely, honestly, consistently noticing, is where everything begins.